Power, when placed in the wrong hands, does not remain neutral. It does not sit quietly or simply exist. It begins to shape the heart, the mind, the choices, the identity. On the plantation in 1847, power did not just shape the actions of the woman who ruled over it, it twisted the core of motherhood itself. Motherhood, something meant to nurture, protect, and cultivate life, became a mechanism of exploitation. The plantation lady did not see her children as children. She saw them as extensions of her will, tools to maintain her wealth, and instruments to increase the number of enslaved bodies she owned. In her mind, blood did not create family, ownership did. So when she looked at her sons, she did not see innocence, growth, or destiny. She saw breeding stock. She saw lineage not of love but of profit. She saw a legacy of flesh, catalogued like livestock. On plantations, the economic system was built on the backs of enslaved people, and for many slave owners, the birth of more enslaved children was seen as free labor, free wealth, free increase in status. This woman took that idea further than most. Her household turned reproduction into industry. She did not rely on outside forces, arrange purchases, or negotiate for new slaves. She created them. And in doing so, she destroyed the sacred structure of family. The sons she was supposed to nurture were commanded, conditioned, and coerced to do what no child should ever be forced to do. Their emotional, physical, and spiritual identity became fractured. They were born into privilege and horror all at once, raised in a world where obedience was demanded and humanity was negotiable. They learned early that love came with a chain, that loyalty came with silence, that their mother's affection was something that could be weaponized against them. And the enslaved women who were caught in this system bore the deepest wounds of all. They were not seen as women. They were not seen as daughters of God, as individuals with dreams, gifts, and dignity. They were seen as vessels. Instruments, bodies to be used and discarded. Their pain was ignored, their motherhood was stolen. Babies born from this system entered the world already claimed, already categorized, already owned. Their first breath was not welcomed with joy. It was counted as property, and in the midst of all this, society looked away. Neighbors whispered. Other plantation owners knew. The system was built on silence. The structure of power kept everything hidden behind white columns and manicured gardens. While outside the home, the lady of the house was respected, admired, and spoken of as refined, elegant, charitable, and cultured. Inside, her world was built on the mutilation of what motherhood is supposed to be. Power did not simply corrupt her. It consumed her. It reshaped her understanding of love into dominance. She believed that because the law allowed ownership of humans, God had approved it. She believed that because society praised her family, her actions were justified. She believed that because slaves were denied education, property, and voice, they lacked souls equal to hers. And belief is a dangerous thing when built on lies. Once someone convinces themselves that another human being is less than human, any cruelty becomes possible. Any boundary can be crossed, any horror can be normalized. The sons, raised under her authority, grew into men who did not know how to separate love from command. They did not know how to heal or resist. They were trapped between being victims and perpetrators, sculpted into instruments of the evil she orchestrated. Their identity was shaped by a world where tenderness was foreign and compassion was weakness. The enslaved children born through this system grew up not only under chains of iron, but under chains of confusion, carrying blood ties to the very family that enslaved them, yet treated as animals rather than kin. This is what happens when power is allowed to redefine what should be sacred, when authority goes unquestioned, when cruelty is excused, when silence becomes tradition. Motherhood ceases to be love and becomes control. Family ceases to be connection and becomes ownership. And the human heart, designed by God to reflect his character, slowly deforms into something unrecognizable, something cold, something that breathes yet does not live. Generational trauma does not begin loudly. It begins in whispers, in secrets, in things the family chooses not to speak about. On that plantation, silence was the strongest chain of all. The woman who ruled that home relied on silence as much as she relied on violence. The trauma she inflicted did not end with her actions. It passed through every person who lived under her roof, seeping into their bones, shaping their voices, their behavior, their understanding of the world. The sons who were raised in that house were born into a narrative already written for them. They learned early what was acceptable to speak of and what was forbidden. They learned that questions were not welcome. They learned that truth was something dangerous. Generational trauma grows when the next generation inherits wounds that were never acknowledged. The sons never saw their mother's actions challenged. No one stood up to say this is wrong. No one intervened. No one broke the pattern. Instead, the plantation walls served as both a fortress and a cage, keeping everything hidden from the outside world. To the guests and the community, this family was refined and respectable. Behind closed doors, they were breaking the very foundations of humanity itself. Because no one dared speak, the sons internalized the idea that suffering was normal, that obedience was survival, and that silence was loyalty. The enslaved women and children experienced another side of this generational cycle. Their trauma was layered. First, they were enslaved. Second, their bodies were treated as commodities for breeding. Third, the children born from this horror were forced to live in the same environment that created them, knowing they were both property and blood. These children grew up watching their mothers suffer, their siblings sold, their identities denied. They had no language to explain what was happening to them. They had no safe space to grieve. Their pain became internalized, shaping their understanding of who they were allowed to be. In a place where truth was forbidden, silence became the inherited language. The sons' silence protected their mother's reputation. The enslaved people's silence was enforced through fear. Both forms of silence worked together to sustain evil. Silence allowed generations to pass without interruption. Silence allowed horror to continue without exposure. Silence allowed everyone to pretend that nothing was happening, even when the truth was sitting in the very rooms they lived in. Over time, silence becomes tradition. Tradition becomes culture. Culture becomes identity. People forget how the trauma started. They only know the behavior they were trained to repeat. The sons grew into men who carried the imprint of their mother's cruelty. They did not know how to form relationships outside of control, obedience, and emotional numbness. They were victims of their mother's manipulation, yet also participants in her legacy. Their identities were shaped by a trauma they never had the freedom to name. The enslaved children born through this forced breeding grew up with questions that could never be answered. Why am I treated differently? Why do I look like the people who say I am not like them? Why does my existence cause silence? They lived with confusion that carved deep wounds into their sense of self. They inherited a world where their story began with violation. They inherited trauma not just emotionally, but physically and spiritually. They were forced to carry pain that did not belong to them yet defined them. Generational trauma is sustained by silence because silence prevents healing. When there is no language for pain, pain becomes identity. When no one names the abuse becomes normalized. When no one confronts the cycle becomes destiny. And in that plantation house, destiny was shaped by the absence of truth. Every person inside that system was trapped in a story they did not choose. The sons could not speak, the enslaved could not speak, and the woman who caused it all would never speak against herself. In the absence of confession, trauma transforms into inheritance. It moves from one generation to the next, living in the way they walk, the way they think, the way they fear, the way they love, the way they avoid their own memories. Silence ensured that no one would break away, that the suffering would continue, that the wounds would deepen, and that evil would grow unchecked. When a society begins to believe that human beings can be owned, something far more devastating happens than physical chains. The very soul of the oppressor begins to rot. The plantation system did not only enslave the bodies of the captured, it enslaved the conscience of those who believed themselves superior. The woman who oversaw her plantation had convinced herself that the people under her control were property, commodities, assets to be managed and multiplied. Once someone accepts this belief, cruelty no longer feels like cruelty. It becomes strategy. It becomes routine. It becomes justified. The soul does not decay with a scream. It decays with quiet acceptance of small evil that grows into monstrous evil. And in her heart, surrounded by privilege, comfort, and unquestioned authority, she did not realize the extent of her own spiritual imprisonment. The enslaved men, women, and children were denied their voices, but the woman who claimed dominion over them was denied her humanity from within. She believed herself free, but she was bound to a world view that required her to shut out compassion, empathy, and the very image of God in others. The deeper she went into this system of breeding, control, and dehumanization, the further she drifted from what it means to be human. She had to silence her conscience to continue her actions. She had to numb her awareness of suffering. She had to twist scripture, morality, culture, and motherhood itself to justify what she did. Every time she ignored a cry, every time she dismissed the humanity of another person, another piece of her soul calcified, turning cold and unresponsive. Those who believe they own others do not simply control their victims, they reshape themselves, they become dependent on dominance. They require obedience to feel secure. They rely on silence to feel righteous. The chains around the enslaved were visible. The chains around the oppressor were invisible. And invisible chains are often the strongest because the person wearing them is convinced they are free. That is the tragedy at the core of slavery. The oppressor must kill the part of themselves that recognizes others as equals in order to maintain control. They must blind themselves to the moral reality of suffering. They must convince themselves that what they are doing is necessary, natural, justified, even noble. For the plantation lady, everything in her environment reinforced her delusion. Society praised her status. Law protected her power. Religion, twisted and misinterpreted, was used to affirm her right to own other humans. With every compliment she received, with every nod of respect from her peers, she sank deeper into a world where empathy was weakness and authority was glory. Yet beneath the surface of that confidence, something hollow was growing. When a person destroys others to build their world, that world eventually collapses inward. No amount of wealth can repair a soul that has learned to feel nothing for others. No amount of outward beauty can cover a heart that has forgotten how to love without controlling. The enslaved carried pain because of what was done to them. The oppressor carried loss because of what they became. The children born into that forced breeding system lived in the tension of two truths. They bore the blood of the oppressor, but the identity of the oppressed. They were evidence of cruelty made flesh. Their existence itself confronted the plantation lady with the reality of what she had created. And so she treated them not as children, not as relatives, but as threats to the illusion of righteousness she needed to maintain. The more she tried to hide her guilt, the more deeply she had to bury any shred of humanity within herself. When a person refuses to see the humanity in another, they lose the ability to recognize the humanity in themselves. The enslaved suffered under chains placed upon them. The plantation lady suffered under chains she forged herself. Her power was not strength. It was a cage made of pride, deception, fear, and denial. The tragedy of slavery is that it destroyed not only the lives of the oppressed, but the souls of those who believed they were masters. And the greatest bondage of all is the kind that convinces a person they are free, while their heart is shackled beyond recognition.